Hello everyone, this is Rajesh Sengupta and we are here in the last segment of our discussion on textiles and Mughal miniatures. So here we'll be talking more about the interrelations between courtly art and textile practices beyond visual appearance. I mean, of course, when we sort of start talking about this idea about the interrelations, we cannot really go away from the visual appearance, because all our discussions and all our analysis, they sort of start from the visual appearance. However, we also need to think that, I mean, there are certain things, as we have already started sort of uncovering, that there are also certain aspects which are not strictly visual, but we need to think that, I mean, the relationship between, like, I mean, this different form of art practices are not really always, like, I mean, the visual connections we can draw, but then there are much more deeper connections we can also see that is there embedded in this very practice of making them, and not just seeing them visually. So this aspects we will see them, and then we'll start the discussion today with this notion of landscape. Now, landscape is this idea that we see that, I mean, that is there in many of the paintings that we have already seen, and either and presence of a landscape or absence of a landscape, that we can see them there. And both these cases we can consider that those are conscious decisions made by the patrons as well as the artists or painters, whoever were responsible for them. So in this case, what happens with this notion of the landscape? Now, art historian Nusrat Kazmi has argued that how landscape and portraiture, these two things in the Mughal context, are very closely intertwined. So in many of the portrait paintings we will find in which a lot of cases we see the profile view of the rulers or like the royalties, we find them to be there, and a lot of times we see them to be there on this landscape. Sometimes the landscape in which we see that it's almost like a neutral landscape in which there is a small suggestion of greenery or like a green land, and then on the top of that there is open sky. And in some cases we see that certain elements of like, I mean, garden, architecture or agricultural labors and so on, they are also depicted in the landscape. So in this case, what happens that we see the idea of the landscape is something that is very much there in the representational spaces, and then all this notion of the landscape is also something that is very much connected to the human figures those are depicted in this miniature paintings. Now, in Sylvia Houghtling's work, we also find that there is something that she mentions, that is the landscape of cloth. And by that she means that how there are different kinds of cloth which was flooding the market of Agra or the metropolitan cities of the Mughal Empire, and then all different kind of cloth that sort of like, I mean, created this huge diversity, and also like a symbolic representation of the different regions that the Mughals ruled under them. So this is something we find that in both cases, that this idea of the landscape, whether it is a visual representation of a landscape within a painting, or like if you think about this diversity of the artifacts and textiles that were accumulated, and they also sort of like, I mean, remained synonymous with particular regions or workshops. So then, like, I mean, bringing the land virtually to the Mughal court, and that is how like the idea of the landscape became important. So in both cases, like for the textiles as well as for this miniature paintings, this notion of the landscape sort of loomed in the background. Now, what we see them there, that, I mean, when we sort of see the figural representations, and then like, I mean, the landscapes, and when in this miniature paintings we see them, what Nusrat Kazmi also argues, that they sort of represent certain correlation between them, and then perhaps like the affiliations, like, I mean, if a particular courtly figure is depicted, then the land that is depicted with this courtly figure would have some kind of affiliation with that figure. So it is not something that is randomly selected or just selected to remove all the other details and just to focus on this figure, but the kind of land, whether there is a presence of a landscape, whether there is a conscious absence of a landscape, this speaks something about the people who are depicted there. Now, the other thing that we also find that there is that how the landscape is also something that is usually used there to convey certain things which are also very hard to convey in words. So for example, we see these miniature paintings today, the way we see them as painting today, they were definitely not made for this kind of viewing experience. We can imagine, like, I mean, they were all associated with written words, that I mean some kind of description, some kind of like literary works, and then like these paintings would be there side by side, and they were also there for this private viewing experience, that people would hold them close to themselves, and then like see them, read them, and then put them back to from where they came from. So this kind of like this experience that we are talking about, there are many things perhaps which are not very easy to express in words, and those are the cases we see that I mean how this visual symbols, or like I mean the use of landscape was very much in favor of sort of expressing certain things which are not really easily expressed. So with those things, what we also see that I mean in this case is that perhaps this intermedial references that is there from like I mean how the landscape, this notion of the landscape that is there between like I mean the figural textiles, and then like I mean perhaps the land and the figure intertwined in the miniature paintings, how those things are there, this also suggests a kind of intermedial cross referencing, and this kind of referencing that we see them there is much more than just to think in terms of like I mean how one person would be doing something and another person would be copying that and implementing that in another medium, but it is kind of like I mean all of them, we need to imagine them to be working under this same, with this shared visual vocabulary, from which like I mean they would borrow certain motifs, and then like I mean perhaps we can see that I mean similar kind of, not only just like I mean similar kind of images are there, but the same life vitality we will be seeing them in across media, and that's something which goes beyond the visual appearance, but it is much more about like I mean how we think about the life of these motifs and how we see them being depicted either on the textiles or in the paintings. So if we kind of like I mean consider this and sort of also take this kind of examples to understand certain larger patterns in the Mughal Empire, we can see that I mean this knowledge circulation across media was something that was very much prominent. And knowledge circulation, by that I mean that I mean if you are thinking in terms of like using a shared visual vocabulary between the miniature painters and then the carpet makers, brocade makers, and then of course like I mean you know the embroiderers. So we can imagine that I mean all of these peoples, a lot of times they were not really present in the same place. As I have already mentioned in the earlier lectures, that when we say that Mughal textiles or textiles came from the Mughal Empire, we are not really talking about textiles that came from this small region, but we are actually thinking in terms of this entire Indian subcontinent, from the western frontier to the eastern frontier. So the embroiders, the mochi embroiders, they were perhaps been based in Gujarat, in Ahmedabad or somewhere, and then the brocade makers were perhaps in Gujarat, some were perhaps in other parts of the northern Indian plain like Agra, Banaras and places like that, and then definitely like muslin that came from eastern India, from Bengal. So like I mean we are definitely not thinking that this knowledge circulation across media is something that is happening within a close proximity, but then we are thinking in terms of this expansive geographical travel that either these objects were doing, or like the artisans who were associated with them, they were able to like I mean travel from one place to another. The other possibility that also comes up, and which will also come up in our next module, is the use of reference drawings or reference material, and how those reference material can interconnect certain kind of practices. That I mean perhaps one practice that is happening in one region, and then if the regional artisans are not able to travel, or if the regional artisans they do not have the exposure what is happening in the other parts of the Indian subcontinent, perhaps like I mean bringing all those kind of reference drawings or those resource material that help or like I mean that sort of enabled this kind of knowledge exchanges. And this knowledge exchanges is happening not only in one particular medium, like we are not talking about just miniature painting to miniature painting, but we are talking about a diverse range of media. So in one hand, if you are thinking in terms of drawing things with a brush on a paper, then on the other hand we are thinking in terms of making knots with silk yarn on or like or pashmina yarn on a carpet. And then we are also thinking in terms of making brocade textiles, in which there is this highly complex jala is then put in this draw loom structure for making the brocaded patterns on the fabric. So this different kind of techniques we are talking about here, and then the knowledge circulation was happening between them. So that makes it much more complicated to understand that I mean what kind of knowledge exchange we are talking about here, that it's not something that is simplistic, not only just on the level of the surface, but it needs to have this much more deeper understanding of how each and every motif, or like I mean the color gradation, variation, tonality, arrangement, compositional organization, all these things work in one medium, and how to sort of implement that in some other cases. So this kind of aspects we certainly see that to be there in like I mean in this visual material that we are discussing here. Now in the last segment of our discussion, we'll be sort of talking about the another kind of textiles, and that is the tent. And tents are something we find that to be there very much closely related to the formation of the Mughal dynasty, and then like their travels, and also like I mean how they have arrived in the Indian subcontinent. So what we see there in the king of these tents, so the Central Asian connection is something that comes at the forefront, that how the Mughal emperors, like I mean starting with Padshah Babur, we see them that I mean how Babur was sort of like I mean when he was there in the Central Asian plains, and a large part of his life, even though he was only alive for like 38 to 40 years, but like a large part of his life he had spent on the fields, and then like I mean in the fields with like I mean and then like I mean this tent structures were something which survived him and his family. So we see this huge enclosures were made when he was traveling from one place to another, and there was not really a stable place for him to be rooted for a long period of time before he sort of won over Kabul, and then eventually sort of like I mean attacked the Lodhis in Agra. So what we see there, that I mean this idea of tent being this movable architectural form is something that is there with the Mughals from very early period. Now the tents were something we also see in the Sultanate period and all, but then of course that during the Mughal period, with like I mean this idea of the tent being a movable habitable space, that sort of became much more expansive. And with this we also see that I mean this idea of this movable habitable space, it was not just there in terms of just a living space, but there are descriptions in which we find that when this entire entourage would travel from one place to another, and that in those times we'll find that the tents were sort of put up, and it's almost like an entire movable city would be there with this tent structures. So for example, in Rubilal's discussion of Empress Noor Jahan, who was the co-sovereign with Emperor Jahangir, so we see a lot of these times we find that this extensive travels that Jahangir made, and in many of the travels when Noor Jahan associated him, we find that I mean there are those detailed description about how their entourage would stop in one place, and then those tents would be sort of put up, and there would be enclosures, and it's almost like replicating an entire palace complex or palace and bazaars and everything within those tent structures. So this is something for us to understand, that when we are talking about tent, we are not just talking about a small tent structure that is to give us security and safety, but we are actually talking about having all possible capacities of leading a life that someone would have in a palace or within a royal enclosure, and all those kind of facilities would be available within a tent structure. So this is something we are talking about here when we talk about this particular Mughal tents. So in this case, what we see that the one tent that we have here, and this is perhaps this one surviving Mughal tent ensemble that is there, which is known as Lal Dera, and this tent came from late 17th to early 18th century, and it was during the Mughal conquest of the Marwar and Jodhpur region. And so this tent, this tent ensemble that we see on screen is there with the Mehrangarh Fort Museum. So this is something we find here, that this Lal Dera tent that has been made, and it was made entirely of red velvet. And as we have very briefly sort of addressed that velvet making is this warp pile weave, that is again a very complicated way of doing fabric making, and that is done on the draw loom. So that is the technique that is used here for making the entire tent that we have here. And then on the top of that, we also have that how the intricate embroidered motifs are being made. So the embroidery is done with silk and zari threads, and then on the top of the velvet fabric. So what we see in this tent structure, it is essentially, it's a square tent structure here, and it is of course we can see the enclosure, and then on the top of that there is a roof, so that to give protection to to the people. And then we also see that what is there in terms of there is this central space which is there for the royalty to sit, and also perhaps have a session with the other courtiers. And then we also have this covered colonnade, or this covered corridor like spaces around it. So, and that is how the entire structure of this square structure of the tent is made. So this is something we find it there. And then this arch colonnade that we see there, and this arches, if we see them closely, it is very much sort of reminder of the Mughal arches that we see in the Mughal architecture. So we see these thin columns, and then those arches, this cusped arch in which we see this cusp motif is there all across in these arches. So this is something we find that to be prominently there in the Mughal palace complexes, in this open sort of these structures. And then that is there in this tent structure as well, this thin columns, and then also this cusped archways. And even the kind of motifs we find that to be there on the archways, that the continuation of these pillars, or this vertical strips of this fabric that is there. And then here in this triangular space we have the floral motifs and decoration, very much in alignment with the kind of decorations we will find in the actual architectural spaces. And then we can also imagine that how this idea about tent being a movable city itself, it's not just this much of tent, but we are talking about the entire all the other tents and the entire enclosure being a movable city. So we see that there is a meticulous effort towards sort of making a correlation between the Mughal architecture and the Mughal textile, and that is the reason we find that there is this attention towards sort of almost resonating certain aspects of Mughal architecture within this tent structure. And of course we have poles underneath this fabric structure which would support the roof, and that will hold the structure together. So this is how the tent structures we find them to be there. And then this particular Lal Dera was displayed in this Houston Art Museum in 2018 in this one particular exhibition, and in which part of Lal Dera, and then this entire installation sort of took place within the museum space. And that also sort of gives us a sense of what kind of space the tent actually created. If we think about it, that how there is a roof, and then there is this open structure of this arches, and then with this thin columns that we have here, it's very much like the kind of like the architectural structures that we have in the Mughal metropolitan, the cosmopolitan cities. So for example, this Diwan-e-Khas structure that we see here in the left side of the screen, and it is entirely made of marble, and in this one we also see this kind of this formation in which this squarish or rectangular formation of this structure is there, and then we have those cusped arch gateways or the archways, and then those seemingly thin columns. I mean, of course, for an architecture the columns need to be much more thicker because of like stability, but here for the textile the columns can also be thin because they only need to support the poles which are going sort of like through them. So but overall we can certainly see that there are certain kind of resemblances we can find, and this particular kind of open structures that we find, that there are arches, there are columns, but then there are no specific walls which would sort of like encompass the entire space. But in these cases we find that there were textiles which were hung from the top of them, and that is the reason in this architectural structures we have like those iron nails or like arrangements for like hanging textiles with them. So this kind of arrangement that make us think that how architecture and textile in the Mughal context was very much interrelated, and then like the openness in the architecture is something that is there to be filled with textile. And then in this case with this tent structure that we find it here, that it almost sort of like replicates this openness of the architecture because it is already there within an enclosure. Like here we can see that there is another enclosure that sort of like goes around this tent, that makes us think that yes, there are already like those chicks or like other enclosures which are around this tent that would eventually make this place as a closed space. So this relationship between textile and architecture, we find that to be there very much, that we cannot really say that it's just the textiles, like this tent textile is something that is borrowing from the architecture, but if we consider those aspects of openness and closeness, we find that even the marble architecture or this stable architecture is also dependent on the textiles to be made into this enclosed space. Without the textiles, this structure of Diwan-e-Khas cannot be an enclosed space, as we can imagine. Now the other thing we also see that in the description of this this Lal Dera or this Khanat from the Mehrangarh Museum collection, we see them that it has been considered that it was perhaps been used for a private audience hall, or like this kind of private meetings, and it's not something that we can imagine that was there for a public a meeting for the emperors or the royals. So and that way we can see that this particular architectural structure which this this tent that also sort of reminded us of is of Diwan-e-Khas, and Diwan-e-Khas is also a hall of private audience and not of public audience. So this kind of resemblances, we see that this interrelation between like architecture and textile in the Mughal context is something that is very much contextual. We cannot really see that one was just sheepishly copying the other, but there are many other layers in which we need to understand that what kind of correlations were made, and that is the reason we find that this idea of like this multi-level narratives which are sort of like being built into it, whether we are actually looking at figurative narratives or not, but these levels of narratives which we see them there are actually created through this cross references across media. Now with that, I'd sort of like like to conclude this discussion saying that how when we see the architectural motifs and when we also see that the textiles together, and then what all like similarities, differences we can think of. Now here in the left side of the screen we have this monument that is tomb of Itimadud-Daulah, and that is Nur Jahan's parents, and of course like Itimadud-Daulah was Nur Jahan's father, but then Nur Jahan's his mother was also buried there. And in this particular tomb that we find, it is again, it has this square format with like those 4 minarets corners, and in the center we see that there is this one pavilion on the top of the roof. So in this monument that we find that this marble made monument, it has this tremendous work of Pietra Dura or the Parchinkari, in which we see that how there were the different kind of stone fragments which are used, and then they were sort of like inlaid into the marble for making different kind of colorful motifs. And this is something we see that how the flavor of perhaps that making carpets or the hanging textiles, which we can imagine as like those chicks which would be covering the open area between 2 columns in a Mughal court. So those kind of things perhaps are then reminded of, and then they are perhaps been sort of replicated in the or not replicated, perhaps their essence is sort of brought into the marble structure of this building. And this building, as we can see that it is much more of a closed surface. It's not as those characteristic open spaces of like Diwan-e-Aam or Diwan-e-Khas. And in this case, it almost seems that how the textiles, those richly decorated ornamental textiles, which would be hanging from the roof to the floor, something that is almost like being resonated in the Pietra Dura work that is there all across the walls of this monument. So this is something we can imagine that whether something we can see that this idea about like the exchanges those to take place between textile and architectural motifs are something that is not really just not really single directional, but there are always like this cross references those happened between them, and perhaps that combination of the knowledge that came from all these different aspects had encouraged the artisans for doing these tremendous experimentations, also achieving the kind of skill that is still considered as wonder today. Thank you.